everybody, and thank you so much for attending my presentation this afternoon. The title is, as Nazira said, Lessons from the Past, What are first-year biology students' preferences, aversions, and challenges for the online learning environment within a blended approach at a South African higher education institution. So many of us have experienced lecturing during the pandemic and now post-pandemic as well. And having this experience to swiftly move online when emergency remote conditions came along meant that there were many steep learning curves for us as lecturers and for the students as well. So these experiences contained multiple learning opportunities based on how the online learning platform was rolled out, how effectively we could use it to provide quality teaching, learning, and assessment opportunities for our student. And we had an awareness of the students' experience with making the transition to online classrooms. We also had to rethink how we designed lecture content and tests for the online environment. As much as there were many hurdles that we needed to navigate along the way, the online learning experience during ERT pushed many of us into a space that we may not have ventured into just yet. Considering the VITS learning and teaching plan has evolved to make space for the blended environment where computer mediated activities are meant to be part of the teaching and learning space, and keeping in mind that AI is largely accessible and here to stay, it is time to take stock of what works and what does not work for us and our students in the higher education environment. Our first years, particularly, have had more challenge than is usually anticipated for their transition into university. Not only have they not been accustomed to this physical and social teaching and learning space when they enter university, they also have to make a transition from school, where they were accustomed to mostly the in-person modes of learning, to university, where they have to adapt to online modes and new technologies that are core to learning. In terms of providing a voice for students in our design of our curriculum in biology, we thought it would be important to consider from the students' perspective and based on their experience at university, what were their preferences, what were the aversions and the challenges that they had experienced, and then how we as lecturers could use these insights to enrich the learning experience that we offer at biology. So this line of investigation on curriculum design to include the student voice is meant to address inclusion with the hope that students no more feel that they're just a student number or a sea of faces in academia. Rather, that they have a voice in terms of how we design the teaching and learning framework. The aim here is to enable students to feel part of the learning environment so that hopefully they move towards the view that being at university is about obtaining quality education while fine-tuning their critical skills for employment rather than the university experience being simply a chance to obtain a degree that will gain them entrance into a job. In light of these notions, this study is framed within Nodding's pedagogy of care, which speaks about the lecturer's awareness of student well-being. Here, in the space which connects the students and lecturers, each participant has a social presence and therefore a social connection which can be used to establish a relationship of trust, and importantly, a safe space for students to express themselves or voice their challenges. We also have to consider the technicalities of virtual versus in-person space. When teaching occurs, students could either be passively or actively engaged. Within the in-person setting, lecturers would usually observe student behaviors, look at what the interest of the class was in terms of the questions that were coming up from them, or if students were listening to responses of peers when they answered questions, taking notes, etc. But these observational cues are not as apparent on the virtual space. It is difficult to know whether a student is paying attention or is watching a video that we might post online, or is actually watching a synchronous lecture as if it were a movie, or they were actually engaged in what we were saying actively. In our transition to the blended environment, we have to ask ourselves about the extent to which what we do within the online space to support what is done in person meets the needs of the students and meets the needs for our curriculum. So, emotional support is closely linked to academic achievement. And this is shown by a variety of publications already out there in literature. So, the social presence is key now to customizing learning for student needs when we move into the blended environment. In this research, I proposed that by the lecturers having insight into the aspects of online learning that students perceive to be advantageous to their learning and spaces where they experience challenge, the course design offered by the blended model could provide a more enriched learning experience for our students. Therefore, the research question here is rather straightforward and simple. And that is, what did students perceive as their preferences, aversions, and challenges for the online learning within the blended approach? I taught an online class for the first time in 2021 and thereafter continued teaching in a blended format. I teach at the start of the academic year, and this is the first years that I teach. This course here, that's part of this particular study, has on average about 500 biology students per year. I transformed my traditional lectures to include the online space by creating workbooks in the form of PDFs. I provided readings and weekly homework questions. The workbooks in the form of the PDFs were compulsory for students to complete, both during ERT and since then. But the readings and the homework questions were not compulsory at that stage. The PDF of those workbooks mostly consisted of 3 pages each, where the first page detailed the key principles and learning outcomes for the lecture. So there's one PDF per lecture. And then the following 2 pages that were provided on each of the PDFs consisted of background to the content. I put in diagrams, and I also included prompts or stems or questions that the students needed to respond to. I also told them where in the textbook they needed to read to supplement the understanding that they should have got from my lectures that I did with them as well. So, in effect, they were being taught how to make their own notes in first year. There was about a maximum of 8 questions provided for each lecture on the PDF that I created per lecture. I additionally determined which was the most complex content in each of the lectures, and I made about a 15-minute video for each lecture based on that content. And during the pandemic and post-pandemic, all of these resources were meant to support the lecturing that was done. So I often also provided links from YouTube as well because the students usually enjoy watching these. I, in addition, set up virtual discussions for students to participate on synchronously. Those were recorded and uploaded for students who could not attend the live sessions, but I did away with those live sessions and those recordings when the sessions or when teaching were enabled for us to move back into the in-person space once again. Moreover, and specifically to this initiative I'm reporting on here today, I invited students to complete weekly activities. These were voluntary for students. No grades or DP requirements were linked to these activities at all. The responses that students provided to these activities were confidential between myself and the student, and they would upload them on Ulwazi on an assignment tab. And then I would provide feedback to students. And once again, this was confidential to only those students who had provided responses to those activities. And it was individual. So none of the peers could see what the communications were between each of the students and myself. I received on average about 300 responses per week over the 6 weeks per year that I taught this particular course in this way. So interestingly, students were looking for a space to communicate, particularly these first years. They seem to value confidential communication, and most surprisingly here, they submitted responses to voluntary activities that had no marks attached to them. Our usual experience is that students are marks driven and do not dedicate any time or effort to anything that doesn't have a mark rating. But this appeared to not be the case in this particular situation. So in terms of the focus for this presentation, the questions that I provided on the online activities included things like, what would you like your lecturer to start doing, to stop doing, to continue doing? What resources have you found valuable to supplement your understanding? Because oftentimes students go and look for resources on the internet, and I wanted to know what they were looking at. What are the things that you like about online learning? What are the things that you don't like about online learning? What are the things that you wish were different for this year? So the responses that I had got from students were captured in Max QDA, and then I had analyzed those responses by coding and thematic analysis following Braun and Clark. So there were about, on average, 1,800 student responses that were provided per year online. And the themes that I'm going to speak to you about on the following slides include what I've got listed here in bullet form. So I looked at the student perception of being lectured via online videos, the student's perception of learning by means of the online learning environment, the student's perception of the online assessment experience. There were lots of them who also spoke about isolation from the peers and lecturers and how this detracted from their learning experience or their university experience. And then I also found themes coming across for organization of the course and organization of the student themselves. So I'm now going to speak to each of these themes individually on the slides that follow. So the first theme, as I indicated just now, was student perception of being lectured via online videos. So students felt that when online videos were provided, they were taught by one-on-one interactions since they were not sitting in a large class setting. So they commented that they had a sense of having one-on-one contact with the lecturer, which was fascinating for me. But in terms of the comments that came out from Professor Mahavali, it looks like this emotional connection is what the students were looking for. And perhaps in this particular way, there was actually an emotional connection that did exist for them. They added that advantages were that they could have all the communications and instructions for each course organized in one space. Moreover, they could ask questions at any time and knew that they would receive a response from the lecturer even if it was at a much later time. But other students also found that not being able to ask the lecturer questions in the moment because they were watching these online videos was a limitation to the quality of learning that they experienced in that moment. They therefore also indicated that a lack of interaction with the lecturer did not enable them to probe concepts that they found challenging. And this meant that they were unsure that their learning material was actually accurate. This also causes students to perceive that they were getting more work than they needed to be responsible for within the online setting. And they felt that this was the case when they compared it to what they thought would be the case if they were taught in person. Students also commented that the lecture material seemed to be distributed to them rather than being taught to them by the lecturers. In this way, students had the notion that there was insufficient interaction in the teaching and learning environment for the online component of blended learning. Authors like Q et al. In 2013 shows the need for lecturers to be aware of the student experience so that the curriculum can be designed according to their needs. These comments that have come out from the students in this particular data set show the relevance for communication between the student and the lecturer so that the students feel supported in their learning, but more importantly, have opportunities to clarify their understanding. The blended system provides for these opportunities when the online activities are provided. The next theme that came across was student perception of learning by means of the online learning environment. Students appreciated that they could work at their own pace, and they explained that they could work with concepts at their own pace so that they had time to develop a depth of understanding. They considered that this approach to their learning enabled them to consolidate concepts before having to move to new ones. They could also listen and take notes without feeling rushed to get all the information down from the lecture within a short space of time, as is the case in a traditional lecture. Here, we need to be careful that the students are not using this as an opportunity to only make notes with the aim of memorizing what the lecturer said, rather than taking the time to understand the content. Some students also iterated that when they came across material that they already understood, they could quickly move on to newer and more challenging concepts, and therefore they could get through more of the material faster, and they were then a less time consuming approach. In this way, they had more time that they could allocate to sourcing alternate resources to improve their understanding on areas that they found to be more challenging. Or they could repeat complex concepts that could not fully comprehend. And they found value in being able to access the lecture videos repeatedly and at their leisure. They did enjoy taking charge of the learning autonomy and found that they were learning to be more responsible for their own regulation of their learning. However, they did concede that based on this approach, they attended to some courses at the sacrifice of other courses. Students voiced that they struggled with overcoming procrastination and were not sure that the understanding and notes that they developed were accurate and of sufficient depth in relation to course expectations. It was difficult for them to evaluate their progress with learning in relation to curriculum expectations and were therefore unsure of whether they were falling behind with their learning. When they were studying from home, they indicated that they were easily distracted, especially since they could easily access non academic websites during the time they set aside to actually do classwork. All of these experiences contributed towards a lack of motivation. A minority of the class also voiced that lecturers expected them to self study and self teach themselves. Since there was little interaction with the lecturers online, and this led them to feel too much of accountability towards their own learning and an inability to cope with the workload, and therefore they felt they were falling behind with the syllabus. This meant that they felt the need to seek out additional resources such as videos on the internet to supplement their understanding. So, within the blended mode, it is important to design courses so that what is done online supplements what we teach in person. The next theme that came up was the student perception of the online assessment experience. Students felt that the online tests were easier to respond to compared to the tests that were held in person. They also commented that due to their lack of experience with being tested in person, they would be apprehensive and felt daunted that the examinations would be the first experience of being tested in an in-person, closed, timed assessment setting during the pandemic. But post-pandemic, there were more opportunities for them to write tests in the way that models the exam setting. This is an important connection to make for curriculum design. The way that we teach and assess in the low stakes tests, or the smaller assessments that occur through the year, should in some way be representative of the way that students are going to be tested in their exams. So this would enable students to know what our expectations are of them as well. The blended modes provide the opportunity for feedback to students on aspects where they need to put in more focus, time, and effort to address gaps in their knowledge, as becomes apparent when we go through the answers to the tests when we're marking. They also preferred the flexibility to choose the time of day that they preferred to write the test, since the online environment catered for a longer session within which the test could be administered, and this was unlike the in-person setting, which is more stringent in terms of the time that the test is administered. But here again, it is worth presenting opportunities that represent what the exams would look like. Another theme that came up was the isolation from peers and lecturers. A major theme, which had only negative connotations, was the students' perception that a lack of interaction with peers and lecturers impacted on their learning opportunities, and therefore they had feelings of isolation and inability to form connections with peers or form study groups, and this caused them to feel detached from the university. Within biology, A lack of opportunities for things like field work and lab work takes away from the hands-on learning experience, which provides opportunities for authentic learning that replicates aspects of the workplace environment. While virtual labs did assist in providing for some of these needs, students are usually far more motivated when learning by hands-on tasks. But in this sense, the online space can still be effectively used to help students to consolidate their understanding. For example, if they were to watch someone doing an experiment online and explaining how things happen, even if it's abstract concepts, um, using animations, or the online space can be used to address concepts where um, what was done in person would be extended further by the online resources. The second last topic that came up when analyzing the data was based on the organization of the course. On the one hand, students appreciated the organization of the course material, since all of the relevant material had a structural organization, which helped them make sense of the course material easily. And they found that the course material was easily accessible when it was laid out on the online learning platform. But students also commented that it took them far more than 45 minutes to cover all the online material. What they did not seem to realize was that they needed to work outside contact time as well, even within normal conditions at university. The problem that students experienced was that the lecturers did not have a standard way of setting out course material. And so they therefore needed to become accustomed to different lecturers' approaches and practices, as well as the different structures and course designs for each of the different lecturers who set up content on the online environment. The last theme that came up was the organization of the student. As much as the students valued the autonomy they had for their learning, they expressed difficulty with managing their time, and this impacted on their workload management. And they complained that having too much of freedom was a negative consequence to learning online in the asynchronous mode. Due to the limited skills in these areas, they found that it was easy to fall behind since they struggle to find a fixed routine or rhythm to engage with their coursework. They also commented that connectivity issues with Wi-Fi, the impact of load shedding, had negative consequences to their learning when online lessons were conducted synchronously. Students reported that it was challenging to be in front of a screen for long periods of time when all courses expected them to work according to the usual course timetable during the pandemic. And we need to keep this point in mind post-pandemic as well. In conclusion, as we plan for the blended mode of teaching and learning, it is necessary to understand how the students have received the course delivery and what level of value they have found when teaching activities and assessments are designed for the online spaces. Therefore, student reflections on what works and does not work for their learning development based on the online course design for the blended teaching and learning space can make explicit to lecturers which aspects of the course design need further consideration. While there are a number of advantages that students voiced for the online experience, the balance in how what is done online supplements what is done in person is powerful for the development of learning, since here the social interactions between the lecturers and the students with their peers enables opportunities for learning that do not appear or are not used within the online spaces. So when these two worlds, that is the online space and the in-person space, are well paired and balanced based on how the course is designed, this could better serve student learning experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shalini. That was very insightful. I have posed a question in the chat, but perhaps we can find out if other colleagues have any questions relating to your research. Are there any questions, any comments?
I'm sorry, Nazira. I'm just trying to look for the question that you posed, and I don't seem to see it on my end.
Okay, so I basically wanted to know of recent, right? So what are some of the changes that we made to the lesson or lessons, the pedagogy and assessment, taking into account that students actually Funny enough, they submitted responses to voluntary activities, and they wanted that emotional connection, right? That's actually what they were looking for. And they absolutely, I think they had a disdain for content distribution because that's what they perceived it to be.
Yeah.
And I think they also wanted that continuity or the alignment in the online space to be supplemented in the face-to-face space. So what are
Yeah.
some of the changes that have been made? And then we'll go on to Keshi's comment. You want to go for it, Shalini?
Sure. So some of the changes that we've made was how we actually connect with these students and try to elicit from them what their impressions are, what are the issues they are having. And it's not just in terms of the emotional sense of where they're at, but also in terms of using the trust that we develop by using that emotional space to gain access to the academic challenges that they're having. So the reason I think that they are responsive um, in these activities is because they feel it's confidential between the lecturer and themselves. Because in class, they wouldn't often put up their hands and just ask questions, usually out of fear of what their peers might feel. But when they're given the opportunities to communicate confidentially, then you'd find that they are more willing to ask questions about the academic content that they find challenging or about how they would engage with particular resources or what additional resources they were using. So I found that communication, opening up the lines of communication was quite important. Um, and I'm not sure that I would have realized how important that was if it were not for ERT, because I didn't try any of these initiatives prior to ERT. But during ERT, when I felt that I wasn't hearing the student's voice enough to see how things were going on their end and how they were receiving the course, then I realized that actually this online environment could be a very nice way to hear more voices than we usually do. And so I think what I do now is use that space to engage with them further, to see where they're at with their learning, but also in terms of how they're coping with everything going on. Have I answered your question, Nazira?
No, absolutely. So you've made changes to your approach and to many other aspects. Thank you very much, Shalini. So are there any questions from our colleagues out there? Kashi actually finds it very interesting, and she's made quite a good point there because we tend to make assumptions, about how our students learn. So she appreciates your presentation, and she wants to know, did ERT inadvertently prepare us in some ways to better address the emerging issues of AI then through this?
A very good question. So I think ERT, like I said in the presentation, push the lecturers in many cases into spaces where they wouldn't have otherwise gone, necessarily. So it enabled us to learn how to use their online environment, and we had to do this very swiftly in order for teaching and learning to be effective, and also in terms of how we designed our assessments. Um, in terms of the emerging issues with AI, you know, this is something I am still grappling with, in all honesty, to see how we could use AI as a resource for teaching and learning. And I agree with what the presenters have said over the last 2 days, where it's not a matter of looking at AI in terms of cheating and plagiarism anymore, because this is something that's not going to go away. And so we have to learn how to use AI as part of teaching and learning. And so I haven't integrated anything like ChatGPT or anything like that as yet, but it's certainly something that I'm thinking around at the moment. So I don't have any valuable insights to add there, I'm afraid. Not right now.
All right. Thank you, Shalini. So yes, that's the complexity that we are dealing with. So yes, thank you for that.